It happened in a moment so ordinary that most would have forgotten it by the end of the day. No raised voices, no dramatic turning point, just a simple exchange, brief and quiet, almost invisible as it passed. The kind of moment life scatters everywhere, assuming no one will stop long enough to notice. He stood there, listening more than speaking, offering something small that required no effort to give, a kind word, a patient pause, a gentle understanding that asked for nothing in return. It did not feel important at the time. It rarely does. They barely acknowledged it. Their attention was elsewhere, caught up in noise, urgency, and the subtle tension that follows people who move too quickly through their own lives. They were not unkind in an obvious way. They simply did not see him, or perhaps they did, and decided not to linger. The moment passed, and yet something remained, not outside, where the world measures value in reaction and response, but inside him, where quiet moments often leave the deepest marks. There was no pride in what he had done, no expectation, just a soft awareness that he had chosen patience when impatience would have been easier. He walked away without turning back. At first, it felt insignificant, almost forgettable, but as the hours moved on, a subtle weight settled in his chest. Not regret, but recognition. The understanding that moments like this shape a person slowly, the way water shapes stone. Not through force, but through presence. He noticed how often the world rewarded speed, sharpness, and reaction, how silence was mistaken for weakness, how restraint was confused with fear. And yet something in him resisted that story. He had learned, long ago, that reacting quickly can feel powerful, but it often leaves nothing behind. Silence, on the other hand, stays. It asks questions. It lingers. That small act of kindness had not changed anything around him, not immediately. The world looked the same. People moved the same. Their expressions did not soften. Their words did not shift. But inside, there was a quiet steadiness forming, as if something had aligned. He did not tell anyone what he had done. There was no need. Some things lose their meaning when explained too loudly. He carried it with him instead, like a private understanding between himself and the moment. As the day faded, he realized that the power of that moment was not in how it was received, but in how it was chosen. He could have withdrawn. He could have mirrored their distance. He could have responded with the same indifference that so often passes for protection. But he didn't. Not because he was trying to be better than them. Not because he believed kindness would earn him something later, but because, in that quiet space, he remembered who he wanted to be when no one was watching. There is a strange strength in moments like this, moments that ask nothing and promise nothing. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand applause. They simply exist, waiting to see what kind of person will meet them. He met it with calm, and as night settled in, he understood something without needing to put it into words, that the smallest choices, made quietly and without defense, often become the foundation of inner power. Not power over others, but power within oneself. The kind that does not rush to speak, the kind that does not need to prove, the kind that remains steady even when unnoticed. And though no one else would mark this moment as important, it would stay with him. Not as a memory to revisit, but as a quiet beginning. Silence did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, the way evening settles into a room, almost gently, until suddenly everything feels quieter than before. At first, he barely noticed it. Life continued, conversations moved on, days unfolded as they always had. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The silence stayed with him. It followed him into ordinary moments, walking alone, sitting among others, listening to words that felt hurried and incomplete. He spoke when needed, answered when asked. But there was a growing space between what he felt and what he shared. That space felt heavy, not because he was hiding something, but because holding back requires effort. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness, but it is rarely empty for the one carrying it. Inside, thoughts gathered, feelings layered themselves quietly, like pages in a book no one else could read. They mistook his quiet for agreement. When conversations rushed forward, they filled the gaps with their own assumptions. When he didn't interrupt, they believed they were understood. When he chose not to explain himself, they assumed there was nothing to explain. He felt the discomfort of being present yet unseen. There were moments when he wondered if speaking would be easier, if releasing everything at once might lighten the weight he carried. Words waited just beneath the surface, ready to rise. Frustration, disappointment, questions without clean answers. But something held him back. Not fear, not uncertainty. Something quieter and more deliberate. An awareness that not every feeling needs an immediate voice and not every moment is improved by reaction. Still, the silence pressed in. At night, when distractions faded, it grew louder. Thoughts replayed themselves. Scenes returned with different endings. Things he could have said, tones he could have changed, reactions he could have chosen instead. The mind is rarely silent when the mouth is. And yet, in that inner noise he began to sense a pattern. Each time he imagined reacting, the outcome felt the same. Brief relief, followed by a familiar emptiness. Each imagined response carried the weight of explanation, defense, and regret. Silence, though uncomfortable, felt different. It asked him to sit with uncertainty rather than escape it, to hold emotion without passing it on, to allow feelings to exist without immediately shaping them into words meant for others. They did not understand this. From the outside, it looked like withdrawal, like distance, like indifference. They interpreted his quiet as detachment, never considering that silence can be an act of care for oneself and sometimes for others. He felt the pull to correct them, to clarify, to make himself known, to step out of the quiet and into the familiar rhythm of reaction. The world rewards those who explain quickly, who respond sharply, who fill every pause. But he stayed still. And in doing so, he discovered that silence reveals more than it hides. It shows which emotions are fleeting and which remain. It separates impulse from truth. It exposes the difference between what wants to be expressed and what simply wants to be released. The discomfort did not disappear. It softened slowly as he learned to carry it without resistance. The silence became less of a burden and more of a container, holding what needed time. He realized that emotional discipline does not feel peaceful at first. It feels like restraint, like standing still while something inside urges movement, like choosing to breathe when the body wants to react. This was not calm, not yet, but it was the beginning of control. A quiet understanding that strength is not found in immediate expression, but in the ability to wait, to listen inwardly, even when the world expects noise. And as the silence continued, he sensed that it was shaping him, asking him to become someone who could hold emotion without being ruled by it, someone who could remain present even when misunderstood. Someone learning that inner power often begins in the moments that feel the heaviest to endure. Being misunderstood does not arrive with confrontation. It arrives quietly, through sideways glances, half-finished sentences, and the subtle shift in how people speak when they believe they already know your intentions. He noticed it not because anyone said something openly unkind, but because something in the air had changed. They spoke around him, not to him. Their words carried assumptions shaped by his silence. Where he had offered patience, they saw distance. Where he had chosen restraint, they sensed indifference. In the spaces he left unfilled, they placed their own meanings, often without realizing they were doing so. He felt it most in small moments. A pause that lingered too long. A comment made just loud enough to be heard. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. These were not accusations, but they carried weight all the same. He wanted to explain, to tell them that his quiet was not dismissal. That his lack of reaction was not a lack of feeling. That silence for him was a way of staying present without letting emotions spill into places it could not be taken back from, but explanations require an opening. And they had already decided who he was. There is a particular loneliness in being misunderstood, one that does not come from isolation, but from being seen incorrectly, from knowing that people are responding not to you, but to a version of you shaped by their own expectations. He felt the sting of it, sharper than he expected. Not because he needed their approval, but because being misread challenges something deeper, the desire to be known as you truly are, to be recognized, even quietly, for the intentions you carry. They assumed his calm meant he did not care. They mistook his composure for emotional distance, his listening for passivity, his stillness for weakness. In their world, value was measured by volume and visibility. Anything softer was easy to overlook. He questioned himself in moments of doubt. Was silence truly the right choice? Was restraint protecting him or slowly erasing him from the story others were telling? He replayed interactions in his mind, searching for the point where understanding had slipped away. The temptation to correct them grew stronger, to speak sharply, to react, to prove that he was not what they believed, that he felt deeply, noticed everything, and chose his responses with care. But something stopped him, a quiet realization that defending oneself against every misunderstanding creates a life of constant explanation, that reacting to every misjudgment hands power outward, allowing others to define the terms of your peace. He began to see that not all misunderstandings are meant to be resolved. Some exist as mirrors, revealing the limits of other people's perception. No amount of explanation can make someone see what they are not willing to look for. This understanding did not remove the discomfort. He still felt the distance, still noticed the way conversations shifted, the way his presence was interpreted. But slowly he stopped carrying the responsibility of correcting every assumption. There was a dignity in that choice. A quiet self-respect in allowing others to believe what they would, without chasing their understanding at the cost of his own balance. He realized that his inner world was not obligated to perform for external approval. Being misunderstood, he learned, is often the price of emotional discipline. Those who react loudly are easily categorized. Those who remain calm invite projection. Silence leaves space, and space is uncomfortable for people who need immediate clarity. He accepted that discomfort, theirs and his, and in doing so, he felt something shift again. Not outwardly, where relationships still felt uncertain, but inwardly, where his sense of self grew steadier. He was no longer measuring his worth by how accurately others perceived him. He was Lel, earning to stand quietly in his own truth, even when it was misinterpreted. And though it was not easy, this acceptance marked a turning point. The moment he understood that being misunderstood does not diminish inner strength, sometimes it reveals it. The realization did not arrive as a sudden insight. There was no clear moment when everything made sense, no sharp line separating before from after. Instead, it unfolded slowly, through observation rather than decision, through stillness rather than action. He began to notice how often power announced itself loudly, how it rushed into conversations, demanded attention, and filled every silence with certainty. How quickly people equated confidence with volume and strength with dominance. The world seemed to reward those who spoke first and longest, regardless of what was being said, and yet, beneath all that noise, he sensed something fragile. Those who moved the fastest were often the least steady. Those who reacted immediately were often reacting from something unresolved. Their certainty was loud, but it faded quickly, replaced by the need for the next reaction, the next defense. This was when he understood something quietly important. Stillness was not the absence of strength, it was its refinement. In moments when he chose not to respond, he felt something different forming inside him, not suppression, but discernment. A growing ability to separate what belonged to him from what did not. He realized that NCE gave him time to observe without being pulled into the current of other people's emotions, time to listen without absorbing, time to feel without acting. This was not withdrawal, it was clarity. He saw how often reactions were driven by the need to protect ego rather than truth. How quickly people defended themselves against things that were not actual threats. Words became weapons not because they were necessary, but because they were available. He had lived that way before. Reacting had once felt like self-respect. Speaking up had felt like strength. But now, looking back, he could see how often reaction had cost him peace without giving him understanding in return. The realization settled gently. Not every challenge requires a response. Some moments ask to be witnessed, not confronted. Some tensions dissolve when they are not fed. Some misunderstandings reveal more about the observer than the observed. This understanding changed the way he moved through his days. He became less focused on being heard and more focused on being grounded, less concerned with correcting narratives and more attentive to his own inner alignment. Silence became a space of choice rather than default. He noticed the difference between holding back out of fear and choosing restraint out of wisdom. One felt tight and anxious, the other felt open and steady. And for the first time, his silence felt intentional. He understood that inner power does not seek validation. It does know to need to be seen to exist. It holds its ground quietly, unaffected by misinterpretation or impatience. This realization brought a sense of relief. He no longer felt the same urgency to explain himself. The weight he had been carrying, the need to be understood immediately, began to lift. He accepted that understanding often comes slowly, if at all, and sometimes it is not meant for everyone. There was a quiet confidence in this acceptance, not arrogance, not detachment, just a calm trust in his own awareness. He began to see silence as a form of leadership, of self-leadership, a way of guiding his emotions instead of being driven by them, a way of honoring his inner life without exposing it to unnecessary friction. The world did not change. They still misunderstood him at times, still filled silence with their own conclusions, still valued speed over depth. But something within him had shifted permanently. He was no longer measuring his strength by how forcefully he could assert himself, but by how steadily he could remain himself. And in that quiet realization, he discovered a deeper truth, that inner power is not something you display. It is something you carry. And once carried with awareness, it cannot be taken, only recognized slowly through the calm that follows restraint. The moment came without warning, not as a crisis, but as a familiar invitation, the kind that arrives quietly, disguised as routine, a comment made in passing, a tone that carried something sharp beneath its calm surface, a situation that asked almost automatically for a response. He felt it immediately, that quick tightening in the chest, the subtle rise of heat behind the eyes, the body preparing to defend, to explain, to push back before being pushed. He had felt this many times before, and he knew how easily a single sentence could turn into something heavier. They were watching, not openly, but with the quiet expectancy that follows moments of tension, waiting to see whether he would speak, whether he would match the energy offered to him, whether he would finally break his silence. For a brief instant, words lined up in his mind, sharp, precise, justified. Each one carried the promise of relief, of release, of finally being seen as more than the quiet presence they had defined him as. And then he paused, The space was small, barely noticeable, just a breath longer than expected. But within that pause, everything shifted. He noticed the urge itself, not the content of the words, but the force behind them. The desire to reclaim control, to correct an image, to restore balance by reaction rather than by restraint. He realized something quietly important. Reacting would not give him what he truly wanted. It might bring momentary satisfaction, but it would also pull him into the same rhythm he had been observing all along, the cycle of tension, explanation, and lingering unrest. Silence, in that moment, felt heavier than speech. It sked him to stay present with discomfort rather than escape it, to hold his ground without asserting it, to allow the moment to pass without shaping it through defense. He chose not to respond, not as a statement, not as resistance, simply as a decision made inwardly, without needing to be announced. The silence that followed was brief but noticeable. They shifted slightly, the energy changed. Some discomfort surfaced, theirs, not his. Silence has a way of reflecting things back to the people who expect noise. He remained calm. Inside, the urge to react slowly loosened its grip. The intensity softened, replaced by a steady awareness. He felt his breath deepen, his posture relax. Nothing outward had changed. The comment remained, the tone lingered. The situation did not resolve itself neatly, but something essential had been preserved, his inner balance. He understood then that silence is not passive. It is an active choice to remain aligned with oneself, a refusal to let external pressure dictate internal movement, a way of saying without words that not everything deserves access to your emotional space. They interpreted the silence in their own way. Some saw it as avoidance, others as restraint. Some simply felt unsettled by it, unsure how to move forward without the reaction they had anticipated. He did not correct them. For the first time, he felt no need to manage their interpretation. He allowed the silence to stand on its own, complete and unembellished. Ed. There was a quiet strength in that. Not the strength of dominance, but of self-respect. The understanding that responding to every provocation slowly teaches others how to disturb your peace. This moment confirmed what he had been sensing all along. Silence, when chosen consciously, is a form of power that does not escalate. It does not demand agreement. It does not seek victory. It does not leave behind regret. As the moment passed, he felt something settle within him, a calm that was not dependent on resolution or validation. He had remained present without surrendering himself to reaction. And in that choice, small as it seemed, he stepped into a deeper kind of control. Not control over the situation, but control over himself. A power that did not need to be proven, a strength that spoke only inwardly. And for the first time, silence felt not like something he endured, but something he owned. The moment did not announce itself as important. It slipped into the day quietly, wrapped in familiarity, a subtle shift in tone, a sentence that carried more weight than it needed to, the kind of moment that often passes unnoticed, yet leaves something unsettled in its wake. He felt it before he understood it, a tightening just beneath the ribs, a quickening of thought, the body preparing to move, to speak, to protect itself from something that felt slightly off. It was a well-known feeling, one he had responded to many times before. They were close enough to notice. Not watching intently, but aware. There is a certain attention people carry when tension enters a space, a quiet anticipation as though something is about to be revealed. They expected a response, some form of confirmation, a reaction that would fit neatly into the story they had already written. Words came easily. They always do in moments like this, clear, firm, justified, each one shaped to explain, to correct, to defend what felt misunderstood. He could almost feel the relief they promised, the brief sense of control that follows, saying exactly what you feel, but alongside the words there was another awareness, a recognition of what would come next. The explanation would invite resistance. The defense would require further defense. The moment would expand, pulling energy from him long after it ended. He had lived this pattern before, the fleeting satisfaction followed by a familiar exhaustion. So he did something different. He waited, not long, just long enough to notice the impulse instead of obeying it, long enough to feel the emotion fully without handing it outward. The pause was small, almost imperceptible, but it created space. In that space, he saw the choice clearly: react and be pulled into the current, or remain still and let the moment pass through him. Silence felt uncomfortable. It always does at first. Silence asks you to stay present with feeling instead of dispersing it. It removes the shield of explanation and leaves only awareness. B. Beneath the discomfort, there was something steady. He chose silence, not as punishment, not as withdrawal, simply as restraint, quiet, intentional, unforced. He let the moment remain unresolved, trusting that not everything needed to be addressed immediately. The effect was subtle but real. They shifted. The energy in the space changed. Without the expected response, the tension had nowhere to go. Silence reflected the moment back to them, undistorted, unamplified. He remained grounded. Inside, the urgency softened. The emotional surge lost its edge. What had felt overwhelming moments before now felt manageable, contained within him rather than scattered outward. Nothing had been fixed. The comment still existed. The misunderstanding remained possible. The situation did not end neatly or clearly, but something far more important had been preserved: his inner balance. He noticed how different this felt from holding things in. There was no resentment forming, no bitterness settling in the chest. The silence was clean. It did not come from suppression but from choice, from the understanding that responding is optional even when reaction feels justified. They would interpret his quiet in their own way. Some might see distance, others might sense restraint. A few might feel unsettled, unsure how to proceed without the exchange they had anticipated. He allowed all of it. For once, he did not try to manage perception. There was dignity in that, in letting exist without explanation, in allowing others to sit with their expectations unmet. He understood then that silence can be a boundary without edges. It does not push back. It does not escalate. It simply holds its place. And in holding that place, it protects something fragile and essential: self-respect. He felt it settle deeper within him, this understanding that reacting to every emotional disturbance slowly hands control away. That inner power grows not through confrontation, but through discernment. The moment passed, conversation moved on. The world continued, unaware of what had shifted beneath the surface, but for him, something had changed quietly and permanently. He had witnessed himself choose restraint, not out of fear, not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. And in that choice, silence stopped feeling like absence. It became presence, steady, composed, and deeply his own. Growth rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with clear markers or visible transformation. It moves quietly, almost invisibly, shaped by repetition rather than revelation. For him, it began to show not in dramatic changes, but in the way he responded, or no longer responded, to the familiar rhythms of life. Restraint became a practice, not something he thought about constantly, but something that slowly integrated itself into how he moved through moments of tension. Each time he chose not to react, he noticed a subtle strengthening, as though an inner muscle was exercised. At first, the restraint felt deliberate. He had to remind himself to pause, to breathe, to allow emotion to settle before deciding what it needed. The urge to respond still surfaced, sometimes sharply, but it no longer carried the same authority. He learned to wait. And in waiting, he discovered how much emotion changes when it is given time. What once felt urgent often softened. What seemed overwhelming revealed itself as temporary. Silence gave emotion room to transform rather than solidify. They noticed the change before he did, not in obvious ways but through small shifts. They spoke differently around him. Some became cautious, unsure how to provoke a response that no longer came easily. Others leaned closer, sensing a steadiness they could not quite name. He did not announce his growth. There was no declaration, no explanation. Growth through restraint is often invisible from the inside, recognizable only through its effects. He felt calmer, less reactive, less pulled into emotional undercurrents that once drained him. He began to trust himself more, not because he felt stronger in moments of confrontation, but because he felt less threatened by them. Silence no longer felt like something he endured. It felt like something he could rely on, a stable ground beneath fluctuating emotions. Restraint refined his awareness. He became more attentive to tone, intention, and timing. He noticed when words were meant to connect and when they were meant to provoke. He learned the difference between moments that invited understanding and moments that simply sought reaction. This clarity changed how he spoke when he did choose to speak. His words became fewer but more precise, less charged, more grounded. When he expressed himself, it came from calm rather than urgency, from presence rather than defense, and when he remained silent, it was complete. There was no simmering frustration beneath it, no unspoken argument replaying itself afterward. Restraint, practiced gently and consistently, had transformed silence from a container of tension into a space of peace. He noticed how others reacted to this. Some respected it instinctively, adjusting their own energy in response. Others grew uneasy, unsure how to navigate someone who could not be easily provoked. Silence has a way of revealing where people rely on emotional exchange for control. He did not take this personally. Growth had softened his need to interpret everything as about him. He understood that his restraint was not a message to others, but a commitment to himself. There were still moments of difficulty. Restraint did not eliminate emotion. It did not make him immune to irritation, disappointment, or hurt, but it changed his relationship to those feelings. He could hold them without being shaped by them. This was the quiet power of discipline, not rigid control, but gentle consistency, not suppression, but stewardship. An ongoing choice to respond from lose, rather than impulses. Over time, this choice reshaped his inner landscape. He felt more spacious inside, less cluttered by reactions that once lingered for days. Emotional waves still came, but they passed more cleanly, leaving less residue behind. He realized then that growth through restraint is not about becoming harder, it is about becoming steadier, about creating a calm center that remains intact even when the surface is disturbed, about learning that peace is not something found in the absence of challenge, but in the presence of self-trust. And without noticing when it began, he found himself standing differently in the world, not louder, not more assertive, but quietly grounded. A person shaped not by what he reacted to, but by what he chose to let pass. He did not notice the return at first. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, woven into ordinary moments that seemed unrelated to the choices he had made. There was no clear line connecting restraint to outcome, no obvious reward waiting at the end of his silence. And yet, something had changed. The world began to meet him differently, not all at once, and not in ways that could be easily pointed out. Conversations softened around him. Tension that once clung to certain interactions seemed to dissolve more quickly. People paused before speaking, as though sensing something steady that did not need to be challenged. They adjusted without being asked. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. The absence of reaction had altered the rhythm of exchange. Without resistance, there was nothing to push against. Without escalation, conflict lost its momentum. He did not feel triumphant about this. There was no sense of having won anything. The shift felt natural, like a quiet recalibration, rather than a result earned through effort. It was simply how things unfolded when he stopped feeding what drained him. Kindness returned in small ways, not as gratitude for his silence, but as ease, as moments of unexpected consideration, as conversations that ended gently instead of sharply, as misunderstandings that resolved themselves without needing explanation. Some, who once misread him, now approached with a different tone, not because they suddenly understood him fully, but because his presence no longer triggered uncertainty. Calm has a way of signaling safety, even to those who do not know why they feel it. He noticed this most when he spoke. When he did choose to share, people listened. Not because his voice was louder, but because it was rarer. His words carried weight precisely because they were not constant. Silence had sharpened his voice. He had not changed his values or intentions. He had simply removed the static of unnecessary reaction. What remained was clarity, and clarity tends to be felt before it is understood. This was not karma in the dramatic sense. Nothing was repaid directly. No moment circled back with perfect symmetry. Instead, the return took the form of alignment between who he was inwardly and how the world responded outwardly. He felt less resistance overall, not because the world had become kinder, but because he had become steadier. Challenges still arose, difficult people still existed, misunderstandings still occurred, but they no longer lingered the same way. Without emotional fuel, many situations resolved themselves. Without defense, accusations lost their power. Without urgency, pressure softened. He realized then that inner discipline creates an environment, not just within but around. The way one holds themselves teaches others how to approach. The energy you bring becomes the standard others respond to, often unconsciously. He did not seek this effect. That was the most important part. The return came precisely because he was no longer looking for it. His restraint was not transactional. It was rooted in self-respect, not expectation. There was peace in that understanding. He no longer measured his actions by outcome. He trusted the alignment he had cultivated. Silence had become a way of moving through the world with integrity, not a strategy for influence, and yet influence happened. Not through persuasion, but through presence, not through assertion, but through consistency. People felt the steadiness and adjusted themselves accordingly. He accepted this without attachment. Some connections deepened, others faded naturally. Both felt appropriate. Growth has a way of clarifying what belongs without needing force. In this quiet return, he recognized something essential, that kindness, when paired with restraint, changes the quality of interaction. Not dramatically, not immediately, but fundamentally. The world did not reward him. It simply reflected him. And in that reflection, he found confirmation that the calm he had cultivated was not fragile. It could exist among others without being diminished. Silence had not isolated him. It had aligned him. And the return, unseen but undeniable, was a quieter world, one that no longer demanded reaction to remain at peace. There was no final moment of triumph, no clear ending where everything resolved neatly or permanently. Life continued as it always does, layered, imperfect, and quietly demanding attention. But within that continuity, he found himself resting in something new, a steadiness that did not need effort to maintain. Silence no longer felt like something he carried. It felt like something he inhabited. A familiar inner space he could return to, regardless of what unfolded around him. He noticed it in simple ways, in how his breath remained even during moments that once unsettled him, in how his thoughts no longer rushed ahead to anticipate defense or explanation, in how he could observe situations without immediately placing himself inside them. This was not detachment. He still cared, still felt deeply, still noticed nuance and emotion in others. But his care was no longer reactive. It was grounded, steady, free from urgency. They continued to move through his life. Some stayed close, others drifted. Some still misunderstood him. Others sensed his calm and met it with their own. He allowed all of this without resistance. Acceptance had softened his edges. He no longer needed to be seen in a particular way, no longer needed to be understood by everyone who crossed his path. Self-respect had become internal rather than negotiated. This brought a quiet freedom. He could speak when it felt true and remain silent when it did not. He could engage without losing himself and step back without guilt. Boundaries no longer felt like walls, but like clear lines he could stand behind comfortably. The world felt less loud, not because it had changed, but because he no longer amplified it through reaction. Emotional noise passed through without lodging itself inside him. What remained was space, open, calm, unoccupied by unnecessary conflict. He trusted this space. It had carried him through discomfort, misunderstanding, restraint, and growth. It had proven itself reliable. Silence was no longer something he feared or questioned. It was home. There was strength in this restfulness, not the kind that pushes forward, but the kind that endures. The strength to remain steady when others rush. The strength to listen without absorbing. The strength to choose peace without needing permission. He did not feel above anyone. There was no sense of superiority in high calm. Only a gentle awareness that everyone carries their own storms, often louder than they intend. His silence made room for that understanding. Compassion felt quieter now, less expressive, more consistent. Not something he offered in moments of intensity, but something woven into how he moved, spoke, and listened. Life still presented challenges. Silence did not remove them. Emotional discipline did not eliminate pain or uncertainty, but it changed the way those things were met, with patience instead of urgency, with clarity instead of confusion. He knew now that inner power does not demand recognition. It reveals itself slowly, through how one lives rather than what one claims. Through the ability to remain whole even when circumstances invite fragmentation. As he moved forward, there was no need to carry lessons consciously. They had already integrated themselves into who he was. Restraint, silence, and self-respect were no longer practices. They were simply ways of being. The story did not end loudly. It settled into quiet mornings, unremarkable conversations. Ordinary days lived with an uncommon steadiness, the kind of life that may not draw attention but holds depth beneath its surface. And in that calm continuity, he understood something final and simple, that true strength does not announce itself. It rests, unshaken, unhurried, at peace within,